What's worse, being a man on death row or being a woman on death row? Wait a bit. Please join our growing family by hitting that subscribe button. Your support means the world to us and help us create even more awesome videos. Thanks. The horrors that await anyone sentenced to death in the United States are claimed by human rights organizations to be a form of torture. You may never have thought about what death row is like for women, but after this video, you'll never forget these terrible facts. One of the most horrible things to think about, and the biggest difference between males and females on death row, is that a man will never be pregnant. While awaiting his execution, this is not always true for women. Let that sink in for a moment. Imagine carrying an innocent life inside you while waiting for your own execution. It's a truly awful thought. So, what would happen in this situation? Practically every country has agreed that a pregnant woman cannot be executed until after the baby is born. This makes sense, but it also means that the situation has occurred before. For example, one death row inmate in India was pregnant when she was arrested and sentenced. She gave birth in prison, and her son stayed with her for 6 years. When the sentence was finally slated to be carried out, the boy was taken away by the state and given to a foster family. There have also been cases of children living with their mothers on death row in Pakistan and Uganda, so this wasn't an isolated event. This is a rare but absolutely insane situation to be in. Needless to say, a male death row inmate would never have to deal with being pregnant or raising a child while he awaited his execution. We're now going to focus on death row inmates in the US and how the experience differs between males and females. Death row may be different between states and on a case-by-case basis. However, the experience for females on death row can be vastly different than those of males. This is slightly surprising because on paper it seems that what both sexes go through are relatively the same. But in reality, this is far from the truth. We don't often think about women who are on death row, and that's for a good reason. On average, around 12% of all murders in the United States are committed by females. And since murder in conjunction with other offenses is normally what gets someone the death penalty, there are just not as many females on death row as males. However, there also may be another reason for this, which you may find appalling. Although women account for around 10% of murders in the US, they only make up around 2% of the inmates on death row. On top of that, even fewer than those 2% actually get executed. Most end up in solitary confinement for the duration of their lives, or their sentences modified. This is where one of the big differences between death row for males and death row for females occurs. Even before women are sentenced to death, the process could be skewed slightly in their favor. There are 2 reasons for this, and we'll let you judge if they're fair or not. The first reason why the death penalty is not as common for female murderers as males is because of the nature of the crimes that women commit. The death penalty is normally reserved for killers who also committed other crimes on top of murder, such as large-scale drug trafficking. Normally, in cases where women commit murders, it's their first and only offense. This obviously does not make murder right. However, like with many male murders, if it's the woman's first and only crime, they normally aren't sentenced to death. Capital punishment is typically reserved for serial killers or sociopaths who murder or harm many victims. In the case of most females, the murder is the only crime committed. Again, we're not saying that one murder shouldn't constitute punishment, but for both males and females, it's less likely for someone to receive the death penalty for a single murder. Therefore, the prosecutors who try to convict a female murderer with a single victim don't have a strong case for seeking the death penalty. The other reason why women are sent to death row less often than males has more to do with culture and society than anything else. Whether you believe women and men are equals in every way, or that there are certain inherent differences between the 2 sexes can be a hotly debated topic. Studies found that juries tend to hold the perception that women are more fragile than men and that they have more redeeming qualities. We're not saying this is necessarily true, just that the average jury feels this way. Therefore, a jury is less likely to sentence a woman to death than a man. Defense lawyers claim that it's almost always easier to convince a jury that a female defendant suffered emotional distress. That led them to commit the crime than it is to convince a jury of the same thing for a male defendant. This can allow defense attorneys to seek more lenient sentences for females and oftentimes be more successful. This is just the reality of the system we have, and one major difference of how males get to death row versus females. So currently, how do the two sexes stack up against one another in terms of numbers on death row? Unsurprisingly, there are many more men on death row than females. As of October 2020, the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund published a report stating there were 51 women on death row in the United States. During that same time, there were approximately 2,500 men on death row. And since 1976, when the death penalty was reinstated in the United States, approximately 1.2% of total executions have been females. Once put on death row, things become extremely difficult for both male and female. Female inmates. They're put into solitary confinement, which human rights organizations have classified as a form of torture. They then have to await their execution date. However, the situation for female death row prisoners can be much worse, especially when things go very wrong. A study conducted by the ACLU found that 1 in 5 women on death row said they were assaulted or harassed while in prison. It probably comes as no surprise that most prison guards are males. This means certain situations can become incredibly uncomfortable for women who need to carry out their daily business. A third of the women surveyed report that the corrections officers watched them while they showered or used the toilet. If this was absolutely necessary, which it was not, there were other ways to make sure a prisoner was observed. Males most likely run into similar problems, but the data collected found that 75% of all reported assaults in U.S. prisons come from females. This suggests that the experience on death row, or just prison in general for females, differs greatly than for males. It's interesting to note that although female death row inmates are in solitary confinement like their male counterparts, they know they're being observed. This is most likely a systemic problem and one that human rights organizations have voiced concerns over. Female inmates also tend to be on death row for longer than males. Although you might think this is a good thing, that's not necessarily the case. For both males and females, isolation takes a toll on the mental state of the individual. This is one of the reasons that solitary confinement is seen as inhumane. Since women stay on death row longer, the strain on their mental health becomes greater and greater, meaning female death row inmates are under torturous conditions longer than males. And since the prison system is made up predominantly of men, the cells for death row tend to be designed for the male sex. Biologically, males and females are different. Along with the capacity to become pregnant, women also have to contend with the monthly menstrual cycle. Facilities who are not prepared can find themselves lacking the supplies that female death row inmates need. You can debate whether certain rights should be taken away from inmates, but it's hard to make a case to withhold necessary resources for the biological process of a prisoner, regardless of if they are male or female. At this point, we'd like to mention that things can get a little tricky. It's only until relatively recently that studies have been published about female death row inmates. Our lack of public knowledge is just another difference between males and females on death row. Many studies of death row prisoners lump both sexes together, and there are most certainly many similarities between the experiences of males and females on death row in the United States. One notable statistic is that over the last 40 years, the time spent on death row has increased. This has raised the alarm on the long-term effects of solitary confinement. However, female death row inmates have been undergoing longer times in solitary than males for many years. The average time spent on death row right now is about 20 years. That's a long time for anyone to be in solitary confinement, as we're finding out from numerous human rights studies. But we often forget or didn't even know. This was always the norm for female death row inmates in the United States. It's claimed that the reason the length of stay on death row has increased over the years is to allow the defense more time to gather evidence and exonerate their client. The worst thing that could possibly happen is that someone who is innocent is put to death. Yet innocent people have been wrongfully executed by the judicial system before, and we're still finding people locked up on death row who were wrongfully convicted. Whether slowly losing your mind on death row or being executed as an innocent person is worse, the fact remains time spent on death row for everyone is getting longer, but for women it has been, and still is, longer than men. So who has it worse on death row, men or women? It's not pleasant for either of the sexes, but we assume these people are people who have done terrible things. It can be argued that women who are sentenced to death have unique hurdles that they have to deal with while incarcerated. What may be the scariest difference of all between male and female death row is how little we know about the female experience. The studies that lump males and females together tend to only show the male side of things because their numbers make up most of the system. It's a nerve-wracking thought that we really don't know all the differences between male and female death row. What is slowly coming to light is that female inmates may experience even more trauma on death row than males. So we have to ask ourselves, how broken is our capital punishment system?